Harold had been gone for 2 years, 3 months, and 11 days when the phone rang on a Tuesday morning while I was standing at the kitchen sink, watching the Cardinals fight over the feeder he'd built the summer before he got sick. I almost didn't answer. I'd gotten into the habit of letting calls go to voicemail, telemarketers mostly, and the occasional well-meaning neighbor who still didn't know what to say to me. But something made me dry my hands on the dish towel and pick up. "Mrs. Beaumont?" A man's voice, measured, professional. "This is Thomas Hale. I'm an attorney with Hale and Associates in Clarksburg. I handled some of your husband's affairs a number of years back, before he switched to a firm closer to home. I apologize for calling out of the blue like this, but I've come across something that belongs to you. Something Harold left in my care a long time ago with very specific instructions." I gripped the edge of the counter. "What kind of something?" "A sealed letter," he said. "Addressed to you personally. His instructions were that I was not to contact you until 2 years after his passing, not 1 day sooner. Mrs. Beaumont, I'd like you to come to my office to receive it. And I'd ask," these were Harold's words, not mine, "that you come alone and that you not mention this call to anyone in your family until after you've read what he wrote." I stood there in my kitchen with the morning light coming through the curtains, and I thought, "Harold, what did you know?" My husband was a quiet man. Not cold, quiet. There's a difference, and it took me nearly a decade of marriage to understand it. He watched things. He listened more than he spoke. When he did say something, it meant something. In 41 years together, I only saw him truly angry twice. The second time was 6 months before he died, and it had to do with our son. Our son. I'll call him by the role he played in my life, because the name doesn't matter anymore. Had married a woman I'll call my daughter-in-law. They'd been together for 4 years before the wedding, and I'd tried. Lord knows I'd tried. She was distant in a way that felt deliberate, the kind of distance that isn't shyness but strategy. She smiled at the right moments and hugged me at holidays and called me by my first name in a voice that was perfectly pleasant and somehow always made me feel like a stranger in my own family. My son was different around her. Quieter in a way that wasn't like Harold's quiet at all, more like a man who's learned which words are safe to say out loud. I noticed it but told myself I was imagining things. That's what mothers do. We talk ourselves out of what we see, because the alternative is unbearable. Harold didn't talk himself out of anything. "There's something off about that arrangement," he told me once, about a year before he got his diagnosis. We were lying in bed, the way we used to talk in the dark after the house was settled. "She's just private," I said. "It's not that." He was quiet for a moment. "She watches the finances. Did you notice at Christmas? When I mentioned the property tax going up, she asked 3 follow-up questions. Not your son. Her. I hadn't noticed. But Harold noticed everything. He was diagnosed in January. Pancreatic, stage 3. The word terminal was used at the second appointment, and I remember thinking it was a strange word for something that was happening to a person who was still sitting right next to me, still wearing his good coat, still squeezing my hand hard enough to leave marks. We had 8 months. During those 8 months, my son and daughter-in-law came to visit exactly 4 times. I counted. Each time, my daughter-in-law found a way to steer the conversation toward Harold's affairs. Gently, always framed as concern. "We just want to make sure everything is in order, Dad, so you don't have to worry. We were reading about estate planning and thought it might be worth talking through." Harold would answer in short, even sentences, and when they left, he would sit very still for a while, the way he did when he was thinking through something he wasn't ready to say. The last visit, 2 weeks before he passed, my daughter-in-law pulled me aside in the kitchen while my son sat with his father. She took my hand in both of hers, warm, practiced, and told me that she and my son had been talking, and they wanted me to know they were there for me, that they'd help me through everything that came after, that I shouldn't worry about a thing. "Managing a property and finances alone at your age can be so overwhelming," she said. "We just want to take care of you." I thanked her. I smiled. I kept both things in the correct drawer in my mind, because Harold had taught me that. He died on a Thursday in September, when the maples outside our bedroom window were just beginning to turn. Our daughters, we had two, both living out of state, flew in and stayed for the week. My sons came for the service and left the next morning. The first year was the year of just getting through it. People say that, and it sounds like a cliché until it's the only true thing in your life. I learned to cook for one. I learned to sleep without the sound of another person breathing. I learned to be glad for the Cardinals. My daughters called every week without fail. My son called sporadically, and when he did, the call often ended with some version of the same theme. The house was too big for me alone, property management was complicated, had I thought about simplifying things. Once he mentioned that he and my daughter-in-law had looked into a lovely senior community not far from where they lived. I told him I was fine where I was. "Mom, be reasonable." I said, "I'm fine, sweetheart." After I hung up, I sat with Harold's old cardigan in my lap and thought about what he might have seen coming, because the man had never done anything without a reason. The law offices of Hale and Associates were in a Victorian building on the east side of Clarksburg, the kind that had been a doctor's office or a dentist's office in a former life, and still had that particular hush to it. I drove myself. I hadn't told a soul. Thomas Hale was younger than I'd expected. Early 50s, wire-rimmed glasses, the careful manner of a man who dealt in other people's most important moments. He brought me coffee without asking, and sat across from me with a manila envelope on the desk between us. "Your husband first contacted me 18 years ago," he said. "We handled a real estate matter together, a property he inherited from his father. After he moved on to another firm, we stayed in occasional touch." He paused. "About a year before his diagnosis, so approximately 18 months before he passed, he came to see me privately. He left this envelope in my care with written instructions. The instructions specified that I was to hold it for a minimum of 2 years after his death, and that I was to deliver it to you personally, in private." "He knew something was coming," I said. It wasn't a question. He didn't say, but he was very specific about the conditions. He slid the envelope across the desk. "I'll give you as much time as you need." My name was on the front in Harold's handwriting. Neat, slightly right-leaning, the way it had always been. I had to stop and breathe for a moment before I opened it. There were several pages inside, folded together. The first page was the letter. The rest were documents. "My darling," he wrote. "If you're reading this, then things have gone the way I suspected they might, and I need you to know that I saw it coming, and I made sure you'd be protected. Please don't be angry with me for keeping this from you. I didn't want to put worry on your plate while there was still living to do. But there are things you need to know and things you need to have in your hands before anyone else gets there first." I read it twice before I touched the documents beneath it. Harold had done his homework. That was the thing about quiet men. They work while the noisy ones are busy making plans. Approximately 2 years before he died, he had begun to notice discrepancies. Not in our main accounts, which were joint and straightforward, but in a separate investment account he'd managed quietly for decades. One that I had known about in general terms but never paid much attention to. Harold handled our finances the way he handled everything, carefully, without drama. I trusted him completely and told him so, which apparently was part of the problem. Our son had worked for Harold's small manufacturing company for 6 years. He'd had signatory access to certain business accounts as part of his role. What Harold discovered, over the course of about 8 months of quiet investigation, receipts, bank statements, records he'd pulled himself without saying a word to anyone, was that his son had been systematically skimming from the business. Not enormous sums at any one time. Enough, over years, to add up to something significant. And enough, Harold wrote, to explain a lifestyle that had always seemed slightly beyond what our son's salary should have supported. When Harold confronted him, privately, without me present, our son had cried. He'd made promises. He'd blamed stress, debt, pressure he hadn't known how to ask for help with. Harold had been moved. He was a father, after all, but he was not naive. He forgave what he could forgive, extracted a signed acknowledgement of the debt, and then went to Thomas Hale to make sure that what he'd spent a lifetime building would be protected. The documents included that acknowledgement, signed, dated, witnessed. A record of every discrepancy Harold had cataloged, cross-referenced with account records he'd had the foresight to preserve and triplicate. A formal amendment to his will, drawn up through Hale, that made the disposition of assets crystal clear and included a specific clause that any legal challenge to the estate would result in an immediate clawback provision triggered against our son's inheritance share. Harold had essentially built a trap and left the door open just wide enough to see who would walk through it. "I love our son," he wrote near the end of the letter. "I grieve what he chose to do, but I love you more, and I know you, and I know that without this, you would have given him whatever he asked for because that's who you are. I don't want you to have to fight. But if you have to fight, I want you to win. Everything you need is in this envelope. Find a good attorney, trust your instincts, and don't you dare let anyone move you out of that house." I sat in Thomas Hale's office for a long time after I finished reading. He brought me a second cup of coffee and didn't ask any questions. When I finally looked up, I said, "He was always 3 steps ahead of everyone." "That was my impression of him as well," he said. "I'm going to need a referral," I said. "A very good family attorney." He was already writing a name on a card. My son called that same evening. I've often wondered since whether that was coincidence or whether someone had noticed my car in Clarksburg. My daughter-in-law had a way of knowing things she shouldn't have known. "Mom, we need to talk about the house," he said. No greeting, barely. "I've been in touch with a real estate agent, just to get a sense of the market. I think we should sit down and have a real conversation about your options." "That's interesting timing," I said. A pause. "What do you mean?" "I mean it's interesting timing," I said pleasantly. "I've had a busy day. Can we talk next week?" He said yes, and I could hear the slight recalibration in his voice, that almost imperceptible shift when a plan meets unexpected resistance. I recognized it because Harold had described it to me in his letter. "He'll push," he'd written. "Be patient. Don't show your hand until the attorney says it's time." I sat with the cardigan again that night. I thought about Harold sitting across from his only son and hearing the admission, and still, forgiving him enough to leave him a share. I thought about what it costs a person to hold that much information and carry it quietly for 2 years without a word. I thought about 41 years and cardinals and the particular way he'd always squeezed my hand. "You were something else," I said to the empty room. "You really were." My attorney's name was Helen Marsh, and she had the kind of calm that I imagined came from decades of watching people behave at their very worst over money and property and grief. She reviewed Harold's documents for 2 days before she called me in. "Your husband was meticulous," she said. It sounded like a compliment of the highest order coming from her. This acknowledgement alone would have significant weight. Combined with the account records and the amended will, what you have here is a very strong position. What will they do when they realize I have it? Depends on how well advised they are, she said. They may threaten a challenge to the estate. That's standard. It's meant to exhaust you into settling. The clawback clause your husband built in makes a challenge extremely risky on their end. If they proceed and lose, they stand to forfeit what's already been distributed to them. So they'd be gambling, I said. People make bad gambles when they're angry, she said. We prepare for that. We prepared for 3 months. I kept my conversations with my son exactly as they had been. Surface level, warm, unrevealing. My daughter-in-law began calling more frequently, which I found instructive. She was charming on the phone in the way she'd always been charming, and I listened and gave nothing away and thought about Harold. The conversation I'd been waiting for came on a Sunday afternoon in April. My son arrived at the house, unannounced, which told me everything, with my daughter-in-law and a folder of papers he said he'd had drawn up by their attorney. He sat across from me at the kitchen table where Harold and I had eaten 30 years of meals, and he told me that he felt the estate hadn't been handled fairly, that Dad would have wanted the property assets restructured, that this was really the simplest solution for everyone involved. He slid the papers across the table. I looked at them without picking them up. I've already spoken with my attorney about this, I said. My daughter-in-law's expression shifted, just slightly. Your attorney? Helen Marsh. She's been advising me for a few months now. She's reviewed your father's estate documents. All of them. I looked at my son, including some documents I received recently that I think you should know exist. The silence in that kitchen was a very specific kind of silence. The kind that comes when someone realizes the ground has shifted and they can't quite find their footing. "What documents?" my son said. "I think that's a conversation for our attorneys," I said, "but I want you to hear this from me directly, not from a letter. Your father knew. He knew for a long time. And he forgave you for it. He said so, in his own words. He left you a share, even knowing what he knew, because he was your father and he loved you." My daughter-in-law opened her mouth. I held up one hand. "I'm not finished." My voice was steady. I was surprised how steady it was. "What I will not do is surrender what he spent a lifetime building because it's the easier path. Not for anyone. If you want to pursue a legal challenge, that is your right. But I need you to understand what you'd be walking into." My son looked at his wife. She looked back at him. Something passed between them that I couldn't fully read, but I recognized the shape of it, the quick recalculation, the assessment of odds. He looked back at me. He looked, for just a moment, like the boy he'd been to before all of this. "Mom, you should both go home," I said gently. "Talk to your attorney. And when you're ready to have a different conversation, a real one, I'll be here." They filed a challenge 6 weeks later. Helen had predicted it. "They've committed," she told me when the papers arrived. "They can't back down now without losing face with each other." So we proceed. Proceedings meant depositions and documents and the particular grinding patience of legal process. It meant sitting across a conference table from my son and my daughter-in-law and their attorney, who was good but not as good as Helen, while Harold's meticulous records were presented piece by piece. It meant watching my son's face when the signed acknowledgement was placed in front of him, the one in his own handwriting from years ago. He hadn't told his wife about it. I could tell by the way she went still. The mediation session lasted 4 hours. At the end of it, their attorney requested a recess, and when they came back, the challenge was withdrawn. In exchange for dropping the claim, they received exactly what Harold's amended will had specified. The original share, not a dollar more. Harold's clawback clause had protected every other asset completely. The court also ordered sanctions for what the judge characterized as a bad faith filing. My daughter-in-law's attorney made a last-ditch effort to argue the merits, but Harold's documentation was too thorough. Too thorough by a long shot. $62,000. That's what the sanctions amounted to. I didn't ask for that. The judge made that call independently, and I was honestly surprised when Helen called to tell me. "Your husband built an extraordinary case," Helen said. "I've been doing this for 27 years. I've rarely seen estate planning this carefully considered." "He was a quiet man," I said. "But when he had something to say, he said it completely." My daughters flew in for a weekend after it was all resolved. We sat on the back porch with sweet tea and talked for a long time about Harold, about what he'd done and how he'd done it, and why he'd kept it to himself for so long. My youngest cried a little. My oldest, who was practical in the way that Harold was practical, said quietly, "He protected you the only way he knew how." She was right. That was exactly what he'd done. I think about the timing of it often, the 2-year wait he'd built in deliberately. He could have arranged for me to know immediately. He chose not to. He wanted me to have 2 years of grieving without the weight of it, 2 years of just being a widow before I had to be anything else. He measured out his protection in years the way he'd always measured everything, carefully, with me in mind. The Cardinals are back this spring. There are 3 of them now, a pair and a younger one who's still figuring out the feeder. I watch them from the kitchen window, the same morning light. The house is the same. The maples out front are the same. The cardigan still smells faintly like him if I hold it close enough. My son and I don't speak often. When we do, it's careful and civil and carries the particular weight of things that have been said and cannot be unsaid. I don't know if that will change. I hope it does. Harold hoped so too. He said that in the letter, near the very end, in the last lines I've read so many times I could say them by heart. "Be patient with him. He made terrible choices, but he's still yours. Just don't let love make you careless. You can hold both things at once. You always could. I keep the letter in the top drawer of the nightstand on Harold's side of the bed. I've read it probably 40 times. Every time I find something new in it, some small, careful detail I hadn't caught before, some piece of proof that he'd been watching, thinking, planning, loving me in the only way he knew how. Quiet, steady, 3 steps ahead. I'm still in my house. I'm still watching the cardinals, and every morning when the light comes through those kitchen curtains, I think, I'm still here, Harold. You made sure of it.